in the sense of the collapse of industry and the end of the old traditional working class has largely been eclipsed. The old iron law, Ted Grant used to talk about the iron law, that the workers always and inevitably will return to their traditional parties. Well, it was never absolutely true. Of course, for a Marxist, there are no iron laws anyway, and so the whole idea was suspect, if you like. But it never worked. For instance, in Greece, as I said, PSOK arose actually, seemingly out of nowhere, when a new generation was determined to avenge the defeats, first of the Civil War and then of the Colonel's dictatorship, and they needed a new party which was able to express their volatility and their thirst for change and so on. And that itself has now given way to the same phenomenon has taken place with the growth of Syriza and the elbowed PSOK aside. But why did that happen in Greece and not in other countries? Largely, I did a particular study of Greece. I've actually written a book on a couple of years ago. But the main factor is, we had people, at the time of the crisis in Greece, there was kind of armchair sectarians around the world saying, why don't they occupy the workplaces? Well, they didn't occupy the workplaces because they actually, what workplaces? When you look at the actual composition of the Greek working class, 4/5 of the Greek working class are either unemployed or self-employed, or they're working to the new norms, if you like, of capitalist society today. I'll come back to that later. Sorry, again, I'm trying not to take too much time on this. But the displacements of the industrial manufacturing working class, and its replacement largely by the so-called gig economy, right? Of zero-hour contracts, bogus self-employment, casual labour, and so on. It's all that wipes out the differential between living standards worldwide. It's made politics more volatile, more unstable, more unpredictable, and actually, as an indirect effect of the instability of the climate change, wars, mass migration in Europe and the USA, it's opened the way to mass throwbacks to things that we thought we would never see again. But xenophobia, communism, chauvinism, racism, of the most, absolutely the most pernicious, the most horrific forms. There's been this worldwide recoil to the right. The Brexit referendum, of course, in Britain, it's almost unbelievable that most sections of the traditional left in Britain were supporting Brexit. Understandable for academic explanations, but the Brexit phenomenon was definitely a wave of chauvinism, of insularity, of it's an absolutely pernicious expression of a turn to the right in British society. The Trump presidency, of course, the Italian far-right government, the coalition government, the presidential dictatorship in Erdogan, in Turkey, of Erdogan, the devastation of Syria, the destruction of Yemen, the victory now of Bolsonaro in Brazil, the migrants drowned in the Mediterranean, the forcible separation of children at the Mexican border in America, the deportations and incarceration of refugees, the denunciation of migrants, and also in Italy of the Italian Roma as animals and so on. These are all right, we're not yet back in the 1930s, but they're all unpleasantly reminiscent of echoes of the kind of terrible defeats that came at that time. The emergence of also monstrous new regimes, apart from Trump, of course, but Salvini in Italy, and Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland, Duterte in Philippines, Modi in India, Erdogan I mentioned already, Bolsonaro in Hungary, Poland, Austria, Italy, in Asia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the new turn that is very ominous turn taken in India, in Philippines, in Sri Lanka now, just last week, if you like, if it comes to the return of Rajapaksa regime, of course Brazil. So all of these things would, would make it look as if, we're entering into a really dark period of reaction. And of course, having said that, I now want to counterbalance that because, things are never quite as they seem. On top of that, I just saw yesterday on the television news that came out that if I got it right, which is almost unbelievable, that in 2018 the number of people who personally suffered from natural disasters was estimated as 2 billion, which against this general background, it's not exactly a gloomy, it's not exactly a rosy perspective. It's quite gloomy. And yet, there is another side to it, as I said. Since the crash of 2008, there have been popular uprisings that brought down governments again and again and again in every continent. Huge uprisings, huge movements of expressions of the drive of the masses to take control of their lives. The Arab Spring, of course, was reversed. But we saw only this year the overthrow of the government in Jordan by a popular uprising, the defeat of the left in Latin America, but a decisive left majority for Obrador in the Mexican elections. Thailand once again under a military regime, but in Vietnam a massive movement of strikes, demonstrations and protests and so on. It seems we ought to remember when recovering from reeling from the shock, if you like, of the election results in Brazil a few days ago, but only a few months ago there was the biggest general strike in Latin American history took place in Brazil. 35 million workers participated. In India, again last year, the biggest general strike in all world history, I think, where almost 200 million people were out on strike. So it's a very, very, it's not at all a one-sided movement. What we're having is we've got in a period of huge, sharp, sudden turns, sharp changes, movements to left and right, a period of extreme volatility. And that's how we should characterize it, rather than a period of simply of defeats. Because in every one of these cases, we can see that the regimes that establish themselves are actually very vulnerable and very shaky and precarious. And that's, by the way, talking about those things before we even consider what I think is the most important factor in the longer term, which is the rising tide of protests and strikes and resistance in China, which is really could transform the whole world situation. So we have to keep our balance and our sense of proportion, because despite these largely simultaneous defeats, nowhere is the working class crushed beyond hope. I'm always reminded of the quote from Gramsci, where he said, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new can't be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." I think that could almost have been written today about the situation we have today. It's not a question of unrelieved defeats. It's a question of the extreme grotesque distortions that have taken place because of the irresoluble crisis of capitalism and the fact that the workers are not yet organised or mobilised sufficiently in order to overthrow it. Let's also, I must say though, be aware of pedantry and scholasticism. I was kind of motivated to make this point when I read on Facebook the various discussions after the victory of Bolsonaro in Brazil. We mustn't. It's not fascism. I think it's not fascism. It's quite true, but I also think that it's very glib to simply wag our fingers and to lecture the workers on the niceties of Marxist semantics on that point. It is a defeat. It is a big defeat. It's a serious defeat. It may be true the new regime in Brazil is not fascist, but that's little consolation to the victims murdered in the orgy of violence that came in the aftermath of the election. The Pinochet regime was also not fascist in the classical sense. but it lasted more than 15 years. And Bolsonaro's only criticism of Pinochet was that he should have killed more people than the thousands that he did. And his only criticism of Brazil's 20-year military dictatorship was that it only tortured its victims instead of killing them. And I mean, we must not glibly kind of brush aside the deadly threat that means. The current shift to the right, I would like to say something about Britain and the Corbyn phenomenon, because if you like, it's the only flickering light, if you like, glimmering light as far at the moment, as far as Europe is concerned, at least. The key question is whether or not it proves capable of harnessing the discontent and the aspirations of the masses. It is, I mean, it was a tremendous movement. As I say, 500,000 surged into the Labour Party. The Labour Party now has become probably the leftist workers' party of the world. The Labour Party conference which took place last month, it was an absolute breath of fresh air. It was a joy. I wasn't there, but I watched it on television, and it was absolutely. I mean, speaker after speaker after speaker. There were people you worked with. There were people you met in the street. There were people you know, your neighbours. I mean, there were just people talking with absolute sincerity and passion about their lives and how they need to, how they want to change their lives. But I think it's practically certain that there will be a Corbyn government, and my own opinion is it's very likely it could come very, very soon, within the next few months, in the sense that because of the whole mess that the Tories have got themselves into in relation to Brexit, I think from the point of view even of sections of big business, of the establishment, I think they think, look, if we have a no-deal Brexit, it's going to mean absolute catastrophe, a complete loss of any kind of power or prestige for British capitalism, and we have to get some kind of settlement which will work. And I think that they will, since any deal that May manages to cobble together will be rejected in the British Parliament anyway, almost certainly. So I think that the calculations of some sections of the ruling class is, look, a Corbyn government, let them come in for a period, in the hands of the Brexit negotiator, Keir Starmer. He's a safe pair of hands. He's really a right winger in the Labour Party terms. He'll cobble together something, let Labour get all the flack, let them get all the odium of the people who betrayed the people who betrayed the wishes of the electorate in the referendum and so on. Let instead of the Tories getting blasted by the major right-wing movement which is also developing in Britain, let Labour take all the flack for that, let them take all the odium for that, and then they've still got their Blairite fifth column within the Labour Party. There was a big movement, there was an absolutely overwhelming aspiration on the part of the Labour Party rank and file, as shown at the conference, to reselect Labour candidates, automatic reselection, to clear out all the debris of the Blair and Brown years. But that was rejected it was defeated by a bureaucratic trick, if you like, of the trade union delegations, who, without consulting their members, simply put a block on that. So the fact is that the next Labour government will be dependent on the goodwill of a large faction of Blairite MPs, who of course are Tories. They are crypto Tories. They're agents of the bourgeois. And at any time, once they hear the given signal, they'll pull the plug on the Corbyn government, and that will be the end of it. So that, I think, is the calculation. I mean, not necessarily to work out like that, but I think that will be the calculation of at least a section of the ruling class. And my evidence for this is that the sudden, after a hysterical campaign against Corbyn for the last 3 years, I mean, absolutely monstrous, accusing him of anti-Semitism of all things, on top of, all kinds of things. Apparently he's a pacifist, but he's also a terrorist. I don't know quite how they worked that one out. You know, he's a Czech spy, they said at one time. Then they said now they're saying he's an anti-Semite because he stands for the rights of the Palestinians. So I mean, all of this, well, they suddenly stopped all that. Suddenly, the whole hysterical campaign came to a complete shutdown. At the time of the Labour Party conference, they could have really, they had so many opportunities, and they said it was complete silence, not a word. And I think that must be that they were kind of given a nudge and a wink that look, we may need more, so let's lay off him for a while. We can always, turn the volume up later when we need to. Anyway, that's. But the point is, what that means is that the Corbyn government coming in, it's got to be huge aspirations and expectations on the part of the masses, of the working class, of the mass of the population, and at the same time, the ruling class will use every possible trick. It'll be like the Allende regime in Chile. They will use everything. They will use racism. They'll use the fact of terrorism. But if they don't have the benefits of the fact of terrorism, they can always switch it on a little bit by false flag operations of their own. They'll use, of course, the run on the pound. They'll use an investment strike. They'll use all the dirty tricks, compounded 100-fold in order to destabilise and bring down the Labour government. And coming close to the end of that. But I think what we have in Britain, it's almost going to be like a kind of Weimar situation, a Weimar Republic type. I mean, it's got there is also the development of a serious, for the first time in the post-war period, a serious fascist movement is beginning to congeal, if you like, and to develop in Britain too. And we could, everything depends. In the same way that Trotsky used to talk about, the key to the international situation in the 1930s. First it was Germany, then it was France, then it was Spain as key to the international situation. And I think Britain, in a way, could also be the same. It could be the arena on which the next stage of the struggle would be developed. And what I would say about the whole period, therefore, is again a favourite quote of mine, which from Hegel actually, which Marx used to like quoting, when he said, "The owl of Minerva spreads her wings at dusk." In other words, it's only in retrospect that you can always see actually the course and the direction in which things are going. Where at the moment things look very bleak or very black, if you like, but there is huge possibilities also, and huge, it could give way to a period of absolute volatility and turmoil. The period after, the period between 1910 and 1920 saw the First World War, a terrible defeat, but also it saw the Russian Revolution, the greatest possible victory. How do you characterise that period? The 1930s themselves, at the same time as all these defeats one after the other, we saw, all the possibilities, the latent possibilities with the sit-in strikes in America and the French Popular Front and the insurrection in Catalonia and so on. And the same thing too, as I've mentioned, various examples, if you like, pointers to the same thing here. So I would say, the main thing is that the proletariat is actually, if you step back from the immediate situation, the proletariat worldwide has never been stronger in the sense it's, for the first time ever, it's a majority of the world population. That itself is it's an absolutely decisive fact. It's extended its reach to every continent. There are 3 billion wage workers worldwide. For every one worker in the so-called West, there's now 5 based in China, Russia, Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and so on. The fact is that women now constitute the majority of the working class and are often in the forefront of struggle, both as militant workers in their own right and also in their traditional role as custodians of family life and at the cutting edge of resistance to welfare cuts. And one last point, I know take a lot of time, but above all, in China, I think we have to point to the key significance. There are 100 million industrial workers in China, more than double the number in all the G7 countries put together. China has now crossed the line to become a predominantly urban society. In 2008, China's economy was smaller than that of Japan, and now it's more than twice as big. That's just in 10 years. It's equivalent to those of all the Euro countries put together. And the strike wave in China, both inside and most significantly outside the official trade union organizations, is growing year by year. And this year, for the first time, there was the first nationally coordinated strikes in China, and also organized solidarity and sympathy demonstrations with the workers on the part of the students. And there's a huge movement building up, which I could say is very reminiscent of the period in Russia when it was industrializing very fast in the 1890s and the early 1900s. So which of course, that meant peasants transplanted from almost feudal medieval conditions into the most modern industrial productive enterprises. The same revolutionizing effect it had on the Russian workers, it's having on the Chinese workers too. And it led in Russia to the strike, to a wave of strikes, and then the 1905 revolution, the development of Soviets, and of course eventually the 1917 revolution. And we could see the same process could well be taking place in China too. And I think perhaps I'll come back later of where I think a new international will come from. But I think the way that in the same way that the first international was created largely and initially by the British trade unions, the second international by the German working class and the powerful movements that they built on, the third international by the Russian working class, and I think the new international, I've got a reason to discuss with Pierre, exactly how we would formulate it. But I mean, the fourth international, in my estimation, was an anticipation and, if you like, a slogan, but it never actually materialised as a workers' international. The new international, I think, will be built largely on the basis of the initiative that will be taken by the Chinese working class too. And I think we have to see everything in that context. So I'm sorry I took a long time.